The November evening had settled over the village of St. Mary Mead with that particular quality of stillness that comes when autumn surrenders its last golden breath to the approaching winter. In the old Victorian schoolhouse, warm light spilled from every window, and the cheerful sounds of the annual harvest festival drifted across the village green like a gentle benediction. Inside, the familiar ritual of community gathering unfolded with the comfortable predictability of a well-rehearsed dance. Trestle tables groaned beneath the weight of homemade preserves and Victoria sponges, while the brass band from the neighboring village of Much Benham provided a soundtrack of slightly off-key but enthusiastic melodies. Miss Jane Marple sat at her customary place near the window, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of long practice as she worked on what appeared to be a soft blue cardigan, though those who knew her well understood that her true occupation was the far more intricate craft of observing human nature. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles, missed nothing of the subtle dramas playing out around her. There was Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in her best hat, attempting to coax the rather stern Colonel Melchett into sampling her prize-winning blackberry tart. Young Dr. Haydock, the nephew of their beloved former physician, stood near the refreshment table, his modern medical training evident in his upright posture and confident manner, though Miss Marple noticed how his gaze kept drifting toward Miss Celia Fortescue, the new school mistress, with the particular intensity of a young man very much smitten. The evening's most controversial addition to the traditional festivities stood at the center of the hall, arranging what appeared to be promotional materials on a small table draped in midnight blue velvet. Mrs. Madame Zelda Petrova, though Miss Marple strongly suspected that neither the title nor the exotic surname were entirely authentic, had arrived in St. Mary Mead 3 weeks prior, taking lodgings at Mrs. Price's boarding house and immediately setting about establishing herself as the village's resident spiritualist. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with an elaborate coiffure of suspiciously black hair, and a wardrobe that favored flowing scarves and an abundance of silver jewelry that chimed softly with her every movement. The decision to include a séance as part of the evening's entertainment had caused considerable discussion among the organizing committee. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had expressed reservations about the propriety of such activities in a church-sponsored event, while others, led by the enthusiastic Mrs. Bantry, argued that it was merely harmless entertainment, no different from the fortune-telling booth at the summer fete. The compromise reached was that Madame Petrova would conduct her spiritual communication session in the old basement beneath the schoolhouse, well away from the main festivities, and attendance would be strictly voluntary. As the evening progressed and the last of the apple tart disappeared from the serving plates, a small but curious group began to gather around Madame Petrova's table. Miss Marple observed with interest the varied motivations that drew people to such activities. There was Mrs. Weatherby, the elderly widow whose husband had passed the previous spring, her face bearing the particular expression of someone hoping desperately for one more word from a beloved departed. Young Miss Pennyfeather, the vicar's niece, fairly vibrated with excitement at the prospect of supernatural communication, while her companion, the practical Miss Blackwood, who served as the village librarian, wore the skeptical expression of someone attending purely to debunk any nonsense that might ensue. More intriguing to Miss Marple's trained eye were those whose motivations seemed less straightforward. Mr. Tobias Grimm, the antiquarian bookseller, clutched an ancient leather-bound volume and appeared distinctly nervous, as if he had brought something to the gathering that he was now regretting. Dr. Haydock had joined the group with the stated intention of observing from a medical perspective, though Miss Marple suspected his true interest lay in impressing Miss Fortescue with his scientific rationality. Colonel Melchett, clearly attending under protest at his wife's insistence, maintained the rigid posture of a man determined to endure whatever foolishness lay ahead with military stoicism. As the group prepared to descend to the basement, Miss Marple made a quiet decision to accompany them. Not, she told herself, because she held any belief in spiritual communication, but because she had learned over the years that people revealed their truest natures in moments of heightened emotion or expectation. The basement of the old schoolhouse, with its stone walls and lingering scent of chalk dust and old coal, provided an appropriately atmospheric setting for such revelations. Madame Petrova had arranged 8 chairs in a circle around a small mahogany table, upon which she had placed several candles and what appeared to be a crystal ball of modest proportions. As the participants took their seats, Miss Marple positioning herself strategically between Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock, the medium began her preparations with theatrical flourish, dimming the electric lights and muttering what sounded like incantations in a language that might have been Eastern European, or might equally have been elaborate nonsense. "The spirits are particularly active tonight," Madame Petrova announced, her accent thickening with the drama of the moment. "I sense great emotional disturbance in this place, echoes of young minds that once filled these rooms with their hopes and fears. We must join hands and open our hearts to receive whatever messages may come." The circle formed with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skepticism. Miss Marple noted how Dr. Haydock's hand trembled slightly as he took hers, while on her other side, Mrs. Bantry's grip was firm with excitement. Across the circle, she could see Miss Blackwood's expression of scientific skepticism gradually giving way to something approaching unease as the candlelight cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. For several minutes, nothing occurred beyond Madame Petrova's increasingly dramatic moaning and swaying. Then, quite suddenly, her voice changed entirely, becoming higher, younger, with a distinct local accent that bore no trace of her usual theatrical inflection. "Please, someone must help me," the voice pleaded through the medium's lips, and Miss Marple felt Dr. Haydock's grip tighten involuntarily. "I cannot rest. There are secrets here, terrible secrets that must be brought to light." Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward eagerly. "Who are you, dear? What is your name?" "Emily," came the whispered response. "Emily Sparrow. I was only 16 when I died, murdered in this very room 20 years ago, and my killer sits among you now." The effect was electric. Miss Blackwood's sharp intake of breath was audible, while Colonel Melchett muttered something distinctly unmilitary under his breath. Miss Marple, however, was watching faces rather than listening to the alleged spirit, and she noticed several things that struck her as decidedly odd. Mr. Grimm had gone quite pale and was staring at his ancient book as if it might provide some explanation for what was occurring. Dr. Haydock's medical training seemed to have deserted him entirely, as he appeared genuinely shaken by the proceedings. Most interesting of all was Miss Fortescue's reaction. The young schoolmistress had gone rigid in her chair, her breathing shallow and quick. "Emily Sparrow," Miss Blackwood whispered, her voice barely audible. "But that's impossible. Emily Sparrow wasn't murdered. She simply disappeared." The medium's head rolled from side to side, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of desperate urgency. "Look beneath the floorboards, near the old coal cellar. The truth lies buried there, waiting to be discovered." At that precise moment, as if summoned by the words themselves, the lights went out completely, plunging the basement into absolute darkness. In the confusion that followed, chairs scraping against stone, voices calling out in alarm, the sound of someone stumbling in the blackness. A scream pierced the air, high and terrible and undeniably real. When Dr. Haydock managed to locate his medical bag and activate his electric torch, the beam revealed a scene that would forever shatter St. Mary Mead's peaceful facade. Madame Zelda Petrova lay slumped across the séance table, her elaborate coiffure disheveled, her flowing scarves spread around her like dark water. The ornate letter opener that had been decorating the mantelpiece, a piece Miss Marple remembered admiring earlier for its delicate silver work, now protruded from between the medium's shoulder blades. Her eyes, which had moments before been rolling dramatically in supposed spiritual communion, now stared sightlessly at the circle of suspects who sat frozen in their chairs. Miss Marple, with the composure that had served her well through decades of observing human nature at its most revealing moments, was already cataloguing the small details that others would overlook in their shock and horror. The way Miss Fortescue's hands trembled as she reached for her handkerchief. How Colonel Melchett instinctively moved to shield his wife from the sight of violence, his military training asserting itself even in civilian circumstances. The curious fact that Mr. Grimm's ancient book had fallen open to a page that appeared to contain diagrams of some sort. And most intriguing of all, the expression on Dr. Haydock's face as his torchlight played across the victim, not the professional concern of a physician encountering sudden death, but something that looked remarkably like relief mixed with fear. The séance had ended in the most permanent way possible, but Miss Marple suspected that the real mystery was only just beginning. In the flickering torchlight of that cold basement, surrounded by the shocked faces of her fellow villagers, she began to weave together the first threads of what would prove to be one of her most challenging cases. For in the space of a few dramatic minutes, the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had been transformed into something far more sinister. A place where old secrets refused to stay buried, and where the living proved far more dangerous than any spirit of the dead. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the basement stairs, no doubt summoned by the screams, Miss Marple carefully observed each face in the torchlight, noting who looked toward the sound with relief and who seemed to shrink further into the shadows. The game, as her dear friend Sir Henry Clithering might say, was most decidedly afoot. The constabulary arrived with admirable promptness, their heavy boots echoing through the basement corridors with a sound that seemed to banish the last vestiges of supernatural atmosphere from the old schoolhouse. Constable Polk, red-faced from his hurried bicycle ride through the November night, took one look at the scene and immediately dispatched young Constable Lake to telephone Inspector Slack at county headquarters. Miss Marple, who had encountered Inspector Slack on previous occasions, suppressed a small sigh at the prospect of his inevitable arrival and the subsequent disruption of what she privately considered the most crucial period of any investigation. Those precious moments when shock had not yet calcified into calculated self-preservation. The assembled séance participants remained in their chairs as instructed, though the mystical circle had lost all significance and now resembled nothing so much as a collection of very ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Dr. Haydock assumed the role of medical examiner with professional efficiency, though Miss Marple noticed that his initial examination was cursory at best. The letter opener, he announced to Constable Polk, had been driven between the ribs with considerable force, suggesting either great strength or intimate knowledge of anatomy. This observation caused Miss Fortescue to press her handkerchief more firmly to her lips, while Colonel Melchett's military bearing grew more rigid still. For a time, chaos wore the respectable face of village concern. The brass band upstairs, startled mid-waltz by the screams from below, had subsided in a clatter of instruments and muttered apologies. Mrs. Clement crossed herself without seeming to notice, then recovered and set about briskly shepherding the more excitable parishioners away from the basement steps. Someone had rung the old school bell wildly. No one ever agreed later who had done so, and the jangling sound accelerated the spread of news like fire through dry heath. When Inspector Slack arrived, his sharp eyes took in the scene with practiced efficiency. He established that the lights had failed at precisely 9:43. Colonel Melchett had consulted his pocket watch immediately upon hearing the scream. The duration of darkness had been no more than 90 seconds, during which time someone had moved with deadly efficiency to commit murder and returned to their seat before Dr. Haydock's torch illuminated the scene. Miss Blackwood, the librarian, provided the evening's most significant revelation when Constable Polk asked if anyone had heard of Emily Sparrow before the séance. Clearing her throat with the authority of someone accustomed to providing accurate information, she informed the gathering that Emily Sparrow had indeed been a local girl who disappeared 20 years ago under mysterious circumstances. She had been employed as a maid at Gossington Hall, the very house that now belonged to the Bantrys, and had simply vanished one autumn evening after completing her duties. The police investigation at the time had concluded that she had likely run away to London, as young girls of her station sometimes did when seeking broader horizons. This revelation caused a noticeable stir, particularly affecting Mrs. Bantry, who began calculating dates with the urgency of someone realizing that a mysterious disappearance had occurred during the previous ownership of her beloved home. Mr. Grimm grew increasingly pale and continued to clutch his leather-bound volume as if it were a lifeline. When Miss Marple inquired gently about the nature of his book, he stammered something about local historical records, though his obvious discomfort suggested his interest might be more personal than academic. By morning, St. Mary Mead had arranged its shock into acceptable narratives, each resident becoming an amateur detective with theories as varied as the patterns in a patchwork quilt. Mrs. Bantry, holding court in her drawing-room, was convinced of supernatural intervention. "That poor woman," she declared to her assembled neighbors, "disturbing the dead like that. Emily Sparrow's spirit warned us that her killer was among us. Perhaps it was the ghost herself, exacting revenge." Colonel Melchett dismissed such notions with military pragmatism, suspecting a disgruntled customer or simple burglar who had used the convenient darkness and weapon of opportunity. Dr. Haydock, back in his surgery, offered a more scientific theory to his nurse about mass hysteria induced by darkness and suggestion, though he added with a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Or perhaps she uncovered something genuine, something someone wanted to keep hidden. Her mention of secrets and under the floorboards was rather specific, wasn't it? His hands, Miss Marple had noted, had been shaking that morning, and he had written 2 letters which he immediately tore up. Miss Blackwood approached the matter with characteristic methodical precision, already researching the historical records of the schoolhouse, while declaring to Miss Hartnell that the medium had been silenced because she knew something inconvenient. Mr. Grimm remained withdrawn, hinting at ancient grudges and forgotten histories while clutching his book, which Miss Marple had observed bore what appeared to be a suspicious dark stain along one margin. Mrs. Weatherby was resolute in her belief that the murder was directly linked to Emily Sparrow's spirit message, insisting that whoever killed Madame Petrova did so to prevent the truth from emerging about what lay beneath the floorboards. Miss Fortescue, usually so composed, remained notably quiet and pale, her distress seeming to go beyond mere professional interest in the schoolhouse's history. Miss Marple sat quietly in her drawing-room, listening to the various accounts brought by visitors and casual callers. She offered no theories of her own, merely a sympathetic ear and occasional thoughtful nods. Her mind, however, was quietly cataloguing the contradictions and overlooked details. The specific placement of the letter opener, the timing of the lights failing, the exact words of the alleged spirit. She had observed the unexpected relief on Dr. Haydock's face when his torch revealed the victim's identity, Miss Fortescue's unusual reticence, and Mr. Grimm's preoccupation with his stained book. "People rarely kill for reasons as general as disagreement with a profession," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry during afternoon tea. "It is nearly always particular." The village had become a crucible of suspicion, and Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that the real story lay not in the dramatic pronouncements, but in the subtle nuances, the things left unsaid, and the peculiar ways human nature revealed itself under duress. The true killer was watching, hidden in plain sight among the theorists and gossips, just as Emily Sparrow's voice had chillingly predicted. The past, it seemed, was refusing to remain buried in St. Mary Mead, and someone was willing to kill to keep certain secrets from coming to light. Inspector Slack arrived at the schoolhouse the following morning with the determined efficiency of a man who preferred his murders straightforward and his motives obvious. He had little patience for village eccentricities and even less for what he termed supernatural nonsense, dismissing the Emily Sparrow revelation as either a prearranged trick or the desperate improvisation of a charlatan facing exposure. His interviews with the 8 séance participants were conducted with military precision, focusing on the practical matters of timing, opportunity, and physical evidence, while steadfastly ignoring what he considered the irrelevant theatrics of spirit communication. The witnesses provided accounts that were frustratingly similar in outline, yet maddeningly different in crucial details. All agreed on the sequence of events, the medium's dramatic transformation, the mention of Emily Sparrow and hidden secrets, the sudden darkness, the scream, and the final revelation of murder. However, when pressed for specifics, their memories proved unreliable. No one could definitively identify who had screamed, though Colonel Melchett insisted it had been a younger voice, high and thin, which caused Miss Fortescue to press her handkerchief more firmly to her lips. Dr. Haydock's medical examination confirmed that the ornate letter opener had been driven between the ribs with considerable force, suggesting either great physical strength or intimate knowledge of human anatomy. Miss Marple, who had observed the proceedings with her customary quiet attention, began her own investigation through the time-honored method of paying social calls. Her first stop was the post office, where Miss Powlett had already assembled a comprehensive collection of village observations and theories. The postmistress revealed that Madame Petrova had been asking pointed questions during her 3-week residence, not general inquiries about establishing a spiritual practice, but specific questions about local families from 20 years past, about servants who had worked at the larger houses, and about any unusual disappearances from the village. From there, Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Price's boarding house, where the landlady was eager to discuss her former tenant's peculiar habits. Mrs. Price had found the medium's nocturnal visitors suspicious. Mr. Grimm had called twice, Dr. Haydock once claiming medical consultation, and a young woman in teaching gloves who smelled of ink and lavender soap had visited briefly the previous Thursday. More significantly, when Miss Marple expressed gentle curiosity about any belongings left behind, Mrs. Price produced a small pasteboard box that the police had overlooked. Inside, among visiting cards and ticket stubs, lay a torn slip of paper bearing the words "Sparrow Beneath Floor," written in a hand attempting mysterious flourishes. The library provided the next piece of the puzzle, where Miss Blackwood had already begun researching Emily Sparrow's disappearance with characteristic thoroughness. The librarian confirmed that Emily had vanished after Michaelmas 20 years ago, employed for only 6 months at Gossington Hall before being dismissed for impertinence. An entry made in a different, younger hand than the rest of the household records. Most intriguingly, Emily had disappeared on the very evening of a dinner party at the Hall, when her absence would have been noticed immediately, making the theory of voluntary departure seem increasingly implausible. Miss Marple's visit to the sealed basement, accomplished through the simple expedient of returning Mrs. Bantry's forgotten shawl, revealed several details that had escaped official notice. The room, without its press of frightened people, showed subtle signs of recent disturbance. One candle had left a crescent of soot across the polished table, as though something had passed across it hastily. Near the table leg opposite Madame Petrova's chair, a faint scuff in the fine dust suggested where someone's heel had slipped during the confusion. Most tellingly, the threshold of the old coal cellar door bore marks of recent cleaning, not the thorough work of the regular caretaker, but a hasty brushing that had left a suspiciously straight edge in the accumulated dust. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. The pattern emerging was of someone who had been living peacefully with an old secret until Madame Petrova's research threatened exposure. The medium's specific mention of looking beneath the floorboards near the old coal cellar suggested she had discovered something concrete, not merely invented dramatic details for theatrical effect. The torn note in Mrs. Price's possession indicated that someone had been feeding information to the spiritualist, but whether as accomplice or unwitting source remained unclear. Most intriguingly, Miss Marple had observed the various reactions to Emily Sparrow's name with growing interest. Mrs. Bantry's eagerness to steer conversation away from Gossington Hall's history, despite her theatrical pronouncements about spirits, suggested uncomfortable knowledge. Dr. Haydock's barely concealed relief when the victim's identity was confirmed, combined with his trembling hands and discarded letters, hinted at secrets of his own. Miss Fortescue's continued pallor and unusual reticence seemed disproportionate to mere professional concern about the schoolhouse's reputation. The village was settling into its evening routines, but beneath the comfortable surface of daily life, Miss Marple sensed the tension of a community, harboring dangerous secrets. Someone among her neighbors had killed twice, once 20 years ago and again the previous night, to prevent that first crime from being discovered. The challenge now was identifying which of the seemingly innocent faces around her concealed the heart of a killer who had struck with such calculated efficiency in those crucial 90 seconds of darkness. Inspector Slack arrived at his conclusion with the methodical satisfaction of a man who preferred his murders straightforward and his suspects cooperative. By midday, his attention had fixed upon Miss Fortescue with the weight of accumulated evidence that seemed, to his practical mind, entirely convincing. The young schoolmistress had admitted to visiting Madame Petrova the previous Thursday evening, a detail confirmed by Mrs. Price's observation of a woman in teaching gloves who carried the distinctive scent of ink and lavender soap that clung to those who spent their days with chalk and children. When confronted in her small office, with its carefully arranged timetables and drooping chrysanthemums, Miss Fortescue's composure cracked just enough to reveal the strain beneath. Her explanation for the visit seemed reasonable on the surface. She had called upon the medium to request that she refrain from advertising her services to the village children, particularly her promises to summon lost spirits of the parish school. Yet when Inspector Slack produced the torn slip of paper bearing the words "Sparrow Beneath Floor" in handwriting that bore suspicious similarities to the neat script on her blackboard, Miss Fortescue's pallor became more pronounced. "You provided her with very specific information," Slack pressed, his notebook poised with bureaucratic authority. "Information that led directly to last night's dramatic performance and, subsequently, to murder when you realized the consequences of your revelation." Miss Fortescue's denial carried the ring of truth, but Inspector Slack had learned to distrust the protestations of school teachers, who were, in his experience, altogether too clever for their own good. Her intimate knowledge of the schoolhouse, including its basement, fuse box, and coal cellar, provided both opportunity and familiarity with the crime scene. More damning still was the practical consideration that someone had moved with remarkable efficiency in those 90 seconds of darkness, efficiency that suggested prior knowledge of the room's layout and the precise location of potential weapons. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to the schoolhouse, ostensibly to deliver knitted mittens for the infant class, revealed details that the official investigation had overlooked in its haste toward resolution. She found Miss Fortescue in a state of carefully controlled distress, staring at a small object on her desk blotter with the expression of someone confronting an unwelcome truth. The object proved to be a delicate tin locket, attached to a faded ribbon, the kind of keepsake a young girl might treasure above all her possessions. "I found it tucked between the floorboards when we were clearing the old cupboards," Miss Fortescue explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "The initials are E.S., and inside—" She opened the tiny clasp to reveal a pressed forget-me-not, brown with age, and a curl of very fair hair. "I thought it might be connected to the Emily Sparrow that Madame Petrova claimed to contact. It seemed like such a coincidence, and Mrs. Weatherby has been so distressed since her husband's passing. I thought perhaps the medium could provide some comfort, or at least return the locket to its proper place." Miss Marple examined the delicate workmanship with the appreciation of one who understood the language of careful stitching. The ribbon had been sewn with loving attention, not the hurried work of a village seamstress, but the patient craft of someone who thought daily about the small neck it would encircle. "It speaks of great affection," she observed gently, noting how Miss Fortescue's hands trembled as she handled the keepsake. Someone cared very much for the girl who wore this. The revelation of the locket's existence cast the previous evening's events in a different light, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about Miss Fortescue's judgment in sharing such information with a woman who traded in supernatural theatrics. Inspector Slack's theory gained credibility when viewed through this lens, a well-meaning but naive gesture that had spiraled into blackmail and murder when the full implications became clear. However, Miss Marple's subsequent investigations through the village's informal information network revealed layers of complexity that the official inquiry had barely begun to explore. Mrs. Bantry, when pressed gently about Gossington Hall's history, admitted to reviewing the household records from the previous owners. Emily Sparrow's dismissal for impertinence had involved her being caught reading in the library, a privilege strictly forbidden to servants, with what the housekeeper had described as papers that were none of her concern. More significantly, Emily's disappearance had coincided with a celebration dinner at the Hall, marking the engagement of the previous owner's daughter to a promising young medical student from London. The guest list, preserved in meticulous household records, included several names that remained familiar in the village, though the participants would now be 20 years older and established in their careers. Among those present had been young Dr. Haydock, not as a guest, but as his uncle's assistant, helping to attend to the medical needs of elderly guests during the lengthy celebration. This historical connection transformed Dr. Haydock's nervous behavior from professional concern into something far more suspicious. Miss Marple recalled his obvious relief when Madame Petrova's identity was confirmed as the victim, his trembling hands the morning after the murder, and his hasty disposal of correspondence in his surgery. A servant girl caught reading private papers about a medical student's background or qualifications might well have discovered information that threatened his future prospects. Her subsequent disappearance, viewed through this lens, took on a more sinister cast than simple flight to London. The village post office, that reliable repository of local intelligence, provided additional pieces to the puzzle. Miss Powlett remembered that Dr. Haydock had shown unusual interest in Madame Petrova's research methods, making casual inquiries about her background and specifically asking whether she had been investigating historical records or making inquiries about past residents. When informed that the spiritualist had been asking about servant girls from 20 years past, his reaction had been immediate and visible. A sharp intake of breath followed by an abrupt departure that Miss Powlett found memorable precisely because it was so uncharacteristic of his usual, composed demeanor. The physical evidence, when examined with Miss Marple's characteristic attention to overlooked details, revealed inconsistencies in Inspector Slack's neat theory. The letter opener had been driven between the ribs with surgical precision, suggesting either remarkable luck or professional knowledge of human anatomy. While Miss Fortescue possessed intelligence and determination, she lacked the medical training that would make such accuracy likely in absolute darkness. Moreover, her position in the séance circle, 2 chairs removed from the mantelpiece where the weapon had been displayed, would have required considerable movement across the small basement room. Movement that would have been difficult to accomplish silently in the confined space. Dr. Haydock's medical training provided both the knowledge necessary for such precise placement and the professional composure to act decisively under pressure. His position in the circle had placed him closer to both the victim and the weapon, while his familiarity with emergency procedures would have prepared him to move efficiently in darkness. Most tellingly, his grip on Miss Marple's hand during the séance had tightened involuntarily when Madame Petrova spoke of secrets and hidden truths, a reaction that suggested recognition rather than skepticism. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence while tending to her garden in the pale November sunshine. Inspector Slack's investigation had focused on the obvious connections: Miss Fortescue's admitted contact with the victim and her knowledge of the schoolhouse. Yet the deeper currents of the case pointed toward older secrets and more desperate motivations. Someone had killed Emily Sparrow 20 years ago to prevent exposure of damaging information, and had killed again when Madame Petrova's research threatened to uncover that long-buried crime. The challenge now lay in proving her growing suspicions without alerting the true killer to her understanding of the case. The village had accepted Inspector Slack's theory with the relief of a community eager to restore its peaceful facade, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface of daily routine, a murderer continued to move freely among them. The past, as Emily Sparrow's alleged spirit had warned, was refusing to remain buried in St. Mary Mead, and someone was willing to kill repeatedly to keep certain truths from coming to light. In the gathering dusk, as lights began to appear in cottage windows and the familiar sounds of evening routines drifted across the village green, Miss Marple began to formulate a plan that would require considerable courage and no small amount of calculated risk. The real mystery was only beginning to unfold, and she suspected that before it reached its conclusion, more than one carefully constructed life would be revealed as built upon foundations of deception and murder. The morning brought Inspector Slack to the schoolhouse with the methodical determination of a man who preferred his cases resolved through practical evidence rather than village speculation. His examination of the basement's electrical system revealed details that cast his theory about Miss Fortescue in an even more favorable light. Mr. Roper, the elderly caretaker, explained with reluctant honesty that the temperamental fuse box had been deliberately tampered with. The main plug found carefully placed on a shelf in the paint cupboard rather than fallen there by accident. "The door was shut, Inspector," Mr. Roper admitted, his weathered hands worrying the brim of his cap. "Couldn't have gotten there natural-like. Someone put it there deliberate, knowing exactly where to find it again in the dark." When pressed about access to the cupboard, Mr. Roper's revelation that Miss Fortescue kept one of only 2 keys seemed to seal the case in Slack's mind. However, Miss Marple, observing the exchange with characteristic quiet attention, noted the caretaker's additional detail, that the cupboard's metal handle bore traces of an oily substance, recently wiped away, but still faintly detectable. The residue had an antiseptic quality that reminded her more of a medical surgery than a school maintenance cupboard. Miss Marple's subsequent social calls through the village yielded information that painted a more complex picture of the events 20 years past. Mrs. Weatherby, Emily Sparrow's elderly relative, provided crucial details about the girl's character and circumstances. Emily had been dismissed from Gossington Hall for reading where she oughtn't, but Mrs. Weatherby's description suggested intellectual curiosity rather than mere impertinence. She had a quick mind, did Emily, the old woman reflected, her fingers tracing the delicate tin locket that Miss Fortescue had discovered. Always asking questions about the gentlemen visitors, particularly the young medical student who came to assist at the grand parties. She mentioned once that she'd seen him preparing special medicines in the estate's small laboratory, treatments he claimed were advanced continental methods not yet accepted in England. The visit to Mr. Grimm's antiquarian bookshop provided another piece of the puzzle, though one that initially seemed to support Inspector Slack's theory. The nervous bookseller admitted to feeding information to Madame Petrova, including the specific phrase about looking beneath the floorboards. His motivation had been a mixture of scholarly curiosity and commercial ambition. He had hoped either to expose the medium as a fraud or to uncover a genuine local scandal that might prove profitable. However, Miss Marple's examination of the note he had written to Madame Petrova revealed an interesting detail that Inspector Slack had overlooked in his haste to connect it to Miss Fortescue's handwriting. The formation of certain letters, particularly the distinctive backward slant of the letter H and the leftward drag of the S, suggested a left-handed writer attempting to disguise their natural script. Miss Fortescue, who wrote daily on blackboards with chalk-dusted right fingers, would have formed her letters with entirely different characteristics. Her return to the schoolhouse basement, accomplished through the simple expedient of delivering forgotten mittens to the constable on duty, allowed Miss Marple to examine the scene with greater attention to overlooked details. The area near the coal cellar door showed signs of recent disturbance beyond what the official investigation had noted. One floorboard, when pressed gently, yielded slightly more than its neighbors, and the surrounding dust patterns suggested it had been recently lifted and carefully replaced. Most significantly, her subtle testing of Dr. Haydock's reactions during a routine medical consultation revealed behavior that struck her as distinctly suspicious. When she mentioned the engagement celebration at Gossington Hall 20 years past, his composure cracked just enough to reveal genuine alarm. His claim of being merely a junior assistant seemed rehearsed, and his quick dismissal of questions about the promising young Dr. Finch, who had been engaged to Clarissa Tremlett, carried the particular nervousness of someone discussing a dangerous topic. "People do move on, don't they?" he had said, but his hands had trembled as he prepared her prescription, and Miss Marple noticed the telltale ink stain along the edge of his left little finger, the mark of someone who wrote frequently with their left hand, and had done so recently. The accumulating evidence painted a picture far different from Inspector Slack's straightforward theory. The electrical sabotage had been accomplished by someone with both intimate knowledge of the basement's layout and access to medical-grade oils for lubricating the coal cellar door. The note to Madame Petrova had been written by a left-handed individual attempting to disguise their script. Most tellingly, Dr. Haydock's reactions to questions about the past suggested not professional concern, but personal terror at the prospect of old secrets being revealed. As afternoon settled into evening, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from her investigations. Emily Sparrow had discovered something dangerous about the young medical student 20 years ago, something significant enough to warrant her permanent silence. The arrival of Madame Petrova, with her research into historical disappearances and her theatrical but accurate identification of buried secrets, had threatened to expose that long-concealed crime. The challenge now lay in proving her growing certainty without alerting the true killer to her suspicions. Dr. Haydock had demonstrated his willingness to kill when threatened with exposure, and his medical knowledge made him particularly dangerous. The villagers' trust in their physician provided him with both cover and opportunity, while his intimate familiarity with the schoolhouse from years of attending to medical emergencies had given him the practical knowledge necessary to commit murder in those crucial 90 seconds of darkness. Miss Marple settled into her evening routine with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully identified the pattern in what had initially appeared to be random threads. The real mystery was no longer who had committed the crimes, but how to ensure that justice was served without providing Dr. Haydock with additional victims. Tomorrow would require careful planning and considerable courage, for she was now certain that the respected village physician was a calculating killer whose crime stretched back 2 decades. The peaceful facade of St. Mary Mead concealed a truth that would shock the community to its foundations. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous predators often wore the most respectable faces. The game was approaching its most critical phase, and she would need all her understanding of human nature to ensure that Emily Sparrow finally received the justice that had been denied her for 20 long years. By the following afternoon, St. Mary Mead had settled into that peculiar state of suspended animation that follows any great shock, outwardly resuming its familiar rhythms while inwardly humming with speculation and barely suppressed secrets. Miss Marple observed this phenomenon with the practiced eye of someone who understood that pressure, like water, always seeks the weakest points in any structure. It was in such an atmosphere that she found it remarkably easy to invite several key individuals to tea without exciting particular comment, though each accepted her invitation with the particular alacrity of people who sensed that important revelations were approaching. Mrs. Weatherby arrived first, clutching her worn handbag with the desperate grip of someone who had spent sleepless nights wrestling with memories she had tried for 20 years to forget. Miss Blackwood followed shortly after, her arms laden with research materials and the determined expression of someone who had uncovered information that demanded sharing. Mr. Grimm completed the gathering, appearing at Miss Marple's door with his customary nervousness amplified to an almost painful degree, carrying his leather satchel as if it contained something that might explode at any moment. Miss Marple's drawing room, with its comfortable chintz and gentle afternoon light, provided the perfect setting for the kind of conversation that reveals more than it conceals. She poured tea with her usual gracious efficiency, while allowing silences to settle precisely where they would encourage the most guarded confessions. The fire made its comfortable ticking sounds, and outside, the November wind stirred the bare branches with the restless energy of approaching winter. "It has been troubling me," Mrs. Weatherby began without preamble, her gnarled fingers smoothing the delicate tin locket that Miss Fortescue had discovered. Emily was such a careful girl, always thinking ahead. She would never have run away without telling me something, leaving me some sign. We had no one else, you see. Her voice trembled with the weight of long-suppressed doubts. She used to bring me little treasures from the hall. Scraps of ribbon, pressed flowers, sometimes papers with beautiful writing that she said was Latin. She was learning to read them, you know. Medical prescriptions, she told me proudly. Miss Blackwood adjusted her spectacles with the precision of someone preparing to deliver carefully researched facts. "I've been investigating the household records from Gossington Hall," she announced, producing a leather-bound volume from her research materials. The circumstances of Emily Sparrow's dismissal were far more significant than anyone realized at the time. She was caught not merely reading in the library, but specifically examining private correspondence related to the medical qualifications and background of Dr. Cyril Finch, the young physician who was engaged to Miss Clarissa Tremlett. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Mr. Grimm shifted uncomfortably, his leather satchel creaking against his knees, while Mrs. Weatherby's eyes widened with the particular expression of someone whose worst suspicions were being confirmed. "There is more," Miss Blackwood continued with scholarly thoroughness. "Dr. Finch's engagement ended abruptly 3 days after Emily's disappearance, officially due to incompatible temperaments. However, the medical register shows no further practice under that name. Dr. Cyril Finch simply vanished from professional life as completely as Emily Sparrow vanished from the village." Miss Marple's gentle suggestion that they examine the locket more carefully revealed the afternoon's most significant discovery. The ribbon that secured the tiny keepsake had been sewn with loving care, but Miss Marple's experienced fingers detected the slight irregularity that suggested a hidden purpose. With the delicate precision of someone accustomed to fine needlework, she carefully loosened 2 strategic stitches to reveal a whisper-thin roll of paper, so small it might have escaped notice for decades. The message, written in Emily's careful script, was brief but devastating. "If harm comes to me, it will be by the cold door. He says it must be our secret. He says he will come back for me. CF." The initials hung in the air like an accusation, while Mrs. Weatherby began to weep with the quiet desperation of someone whose worst fears had finally been confirmed. Mr. Grimm's face had gone ashen, and his hands trembled as he clutched his satchel more tightly. "Cyril Finch," Miss Blackwood whispered, her voice carrying the weight of historical certainty. "But that would mean—" Miss Marple folded the precious evidence with infinite care, her mind already weaving together the implications. A young man with medical training and social ambitions, caught in a compromising situation with a servant girl who had discovered damaging information about his background. Emily's reference to the cold door suggested she had arranged to meet him in the schoolhouse basement, trusting in promises that were never intended to be kept. The afternoon's revelations took on even greater significance when Miss Fortescue arrived unexpectedly, her usual composed demeanor replaced by the particular distress of someone who had discovered truths too painful to bear alone. She carried with her a water-damaged medical journal that had been hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the coal cellar, its pages filled with Emily's marginalia, documenting her growing understanding of medical procedures and her increasing concerns about certain practices she had observed. She was teaching herself, Miss Fortescue explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily Sparrow was my mother, though I have only recently learned this truth. The vicar's sister took me in when I was born, but she never spoke of my parentage. It was Mrs. Weatherby who finally told me, after I came to teach here. Her hands shook as she opened the journal to reveal Emily's final entries, documenting her suspicions about a young doctor who was experimenting with treatments that seemed designed to harm rather than heal. The journal's pages revealed Emily as far more than a curious housemaid. She had been an intelligent young woman who had recognized the signs of medical malpractice and was preparing to expose dangerous secrets. Her final entry, dated the day of her dismissal, read, "I've seen enough to know that CF is not what he pretends to be. The elderly patients who have died under his care did not die naturally. I must find a way to expose him before others suffer the same fate." As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple's subsequent inquiries through the village revealed the final pieces of the puzzle. Mrs. Bantry's research into Gossington Hall's records confirmed that Dr. Finch had left the engagement celebration suddenly on the evening of Emily's disappearance, claiming a medical emergency that no other physician could verify. Miss Pollitt's investigation into postal records revealed that a Dr. Harold Haydock had established his practice in Much Benham shortly after Dr. Finch's disappearance from medical registers, inheriting his uncle's connections and reputation. The physical evidence supported these revelations with chilling clarity. The antiseptic scent that Miss Marple had detected on the coal cellar door suggested recent medical attention to the area where Emily's remains lay hidden. The precision with which Madame Petrova had been killed indicated surgical knowledge, while the left-handed formation of the note found among the medium's possessions matched the handwriting characteristics Miss Marple had observed in Dr. Haydock's medical records. By evening, the peaceful facade of St. Mary Mead concealed a truth that would shock the community to its foundations. Dr. Harold Haydock, the respected village physician, was revealed as the former Dr. Cyril Finch, a man who had killed once to protect his secrets and reputation, and had killed again when those secrets threatened to surface after 20 years of careful concealment. The confrontations had revealed not merely hidden motives, but a web of deception that stretched back 2 decades. Emily Sparrow had died because she was intelligent enough to recognize medical malpractice and courageous enough to threaten exposure. Madame Petrova had died because her research had brought her too close to the truth about Emily's fate and the identity of her killer. Miss Marple settled into her evening routine with the quiet certainty that the case was approaching its climax. The net of evidence was tightening around Dr. Haydock with the inexorable precision of justice long delayed, but she knew that cornered predators were often at their most dangerous. The challenge now lay in ensuring that the truth emerged without providing the killer with additional opportunities for violence. The game had moved beyond mere detection into the far more perilous realm of confronting a desperate man who had already demonstrated his willingness to kill to protect his carefully constructed life. In the gathering dusk of St. Mary Mead, where cottage lights began to twinkle like earthbound stars and the comfortable sounds of evening routines drifted across the village green, Miss Marple prepared herself for what she knew would be one of her most challenging and dangerous cases. The past had finally caught up with Dr. Haydock, and Emily Sparrow's voice, silenced for 20 years, was at last demanding the justice she had been denied. The morning brought Inspector Slack to the schoolhouse basement with a crew of constables and the grudging assistance of Mr. Roper, whose intimate knowledge of the building's construction proved invaluable in locating the precise area beneath the coal cellar that Madame Petrova's spirit had indicated. The floorboards, when finally pried up with appropriate ceremony, revealed a shallow cavity that had clearly been disturbed within recent memory, though not, as Miss Marple quietly observed, within the past week. The cavity itself told a story that was both more and less than the assembled investigators had expected. The white, gritty residue that coated the excavated space was indeed quicklime, as Dr. Haydock confirmed with professional authority, applied liberally and recently enough to have eliminated most organic evidence. However, the careful observer, and Miss Marple was nothing if not careful, could detect the faint impressions where something substantial had once rested, along with a few heart-breaking remnants that the lime had failed to completely destroy. A small brass button bearing the crown and anchor insignia of a domestic servant's uniform, several strands of fair hair, and a fragment of blue ribbon that matched perfectly the material used in Emily Sparrow's locket. The second crime. The discovery in the basement was overshadowed before noon by a far more immediate tragedy. Mr. Tobias Grimm was found dead in his antiquarian bookshop by Miss Powlett, who had arrived to deliver his weekly order of periodicals. The scene that greeted her horrified eyes was one of obvious violence. The elderly bookseller lay crumpled behind his counter, an ornate letter opener protruding from between his ribs with surgical precision. Unlike Madame Petrova's murder, this crime had been committed in full light, with no theatrical darkness to conceal the killer's movement. Inspector Slack's examination of the crime scene revealed details that transformed the investigation entirely. Clutched in Mr. Grimm's lifeless fingers was a page torn from his private ledger, bearing entries that dated back 20 years. The most significant notation, circled in red ink that appeared fresh, recorded a payment of £50 to Dr. C. Finch, with the notation, "for continued discretion regarding professional irregularities." Additional entries showed regular payments over the intervening decades, suggesting a systematic blackmail arrangement that had provided Mr. Grimm with a steady supplementary income. The letter opener itself proved to be Mr. Grimm's own, a piece Miss Marple recognized from her previous visits to his shop, distinguished by its delicate falcon engraving and mother-of-pearl handle. The weapon's placement suggested either a struggle or, more chillingly, a deliberate staging designed to implicate the victim in his own demise. The precision of the wound, however, indicated medical knowledge and steady hands, characteristics that pointed inexorably toward Dr. Haydock. Crucial revelations. The afternoon brought a series of revelations that illuminated the true scope of the conspiracy that had shadowed St. Mary Mead for 2 decades. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage in considerable distress, carrying a small wooden box that she had safeguarded for 20 years at Emily Sparrow's specific request. The contents, preserved with touching care, included additional copies of the medical records that Emily had secretly transcribed, documenting a pattern of suspicious deaths among Dr. Finch's elderly patients. More significantly, the box contained a detailed letter that Emily had prepared for the medical authorities in London, outlining her suspicions about Dr. Finch's treatment methods and providing specific evidence of what she believed to be systematic poisoning. The letter was dated the very day of her disappearance, suggesting that she had planned to post it the following morning, a plan that had cost her life when Dr. Finch discovered her intentions. "She came to me that evening," Mrs. Clement explained, her voice heavy with 20 years of suppressed guilt. She was terrified but determined to see justice done. She said she had discovered that several of Dr. Finch's patients had died not from their ailments but from his treatments, and that she feared he might try to silence her before she could expose his crimes. The revelation that Miss Fortescue was Emily's daughter, raised in secret by Mrs. Clement after her mother's murder, added both poignancy and complexity to the case. The young schoolmistress had unknowingly spent her career in the very building where her mother had been killed, teaching children in rooms that echoed with the memory of that long-ago crime. Dr. Haydock's desperation. Dr. Haydock's response to these developments demonstrated the calculating intelligence that had kept him safe for 20 years, but also revealed the growing desperation of a man who sensed that his carefully constructed life was beginning to unravel. His immediate attempt to confiscate Emily's journal from Miss Fortescue under the pretext of medical concern for her emotional state was thwarted only by Miss Marple's foresight in creating detailed copies of the most incriminating entries. His subsequent actions became increasingly reckless as the net of evidence tightened around him. The systematic destruction of medical records in his surgery, discovered during a routine visit by his housekeeper, revealed the scope of his crimes and his awareness that exposure was imminent. Most tellingly, his nervous inquiry at the post office about train schedules to London suggested that flight was becoming a serious consideration. Miss Marple's methodical investigation. Miss Marple's quiet investigation of the physical evidence revealed the careful planning that had characterized both recent murders. The medicinal scent that clung to Mr. Grimm's clothing suggested the use of chloroform or a similar anesthetic, applied to render the victim unconscious before the fatal blow was administered. The staging of the crime scene, with the victim's own letter opener placed to suggest either suicide or self-defense, demonstrated the killer's continuing attempts to misdirect the investigation. Her analysis of the timing revealed the narrow window during which Dr. Haydock could have committed the murder. Mr. Grimm had been seen leaving the doctor's surgery at approximately 10 o'clock the previous evening, carrying his usual satchel but appearing agitated. His body had been discovered at 9 the following morning, with rigor mortis suggesting death had occurred in the early hours of the morning, precisely when Dr. Haydock would have had unobserved access to the bookshop. The pattern emerges. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern of deception and violence that had shaped the community for 2 decades. Dr. Haydock had killed Emily Sparrow to prevent exposure of his systematic poisoning of elderly patients, crimes that would have destroyed his career and likely resulted in execution. The arrival of Madame Petrova, with her research into historical disappearances, had threatened to uncover that long-buried crime, necessitating a second murder to maintain his secret. Mr. Grimm's death represented the killer's growing desperation as his blackmail scheme, which had provided him with both income and insurance against exposure, became a liability rather than protection. The bookseller's murder had been committed with the same surgical precision as Emily Sparrow's, but with less attention to concealment, suggesting that Dr. Haydock was beginning to feel cornered and was making increasingly dangerous decisions. The challenge now lay in forcing a final confrontation that would provide the conclusive evidence necessary for conviction, while ensuring that no additional innocent lives were lost in the process. Miss Marple knew that cornered predators were often at their most dangerous, and Dr. Haydock had already demonstrated his willingness to kill repeatedly to protect his secrets. In the gathering darkness of another November evening, she began to formulate a plan that would require considerable courage and precise timing. The game was approaching its climax, and she was determined that Emily Sparrow's voice, silenced for 20 years, would finally be heard in the halls of justice where it belonged. The peaceful facade of village life had been shattered by the revelation of systematic murder, but Miss Marple was confident that truth, however long delayed, would ultimately prevail over even the most carefully constructed deception. The morning would bring new challenges and the final test of her understanding of human nature as she prepared to confront a killer who had proven himself both ruthless and resourceful. The mystery that had begun with a theatrical séance was approaching its resolution through the methodical application of observation, deduction, and an unwavering commitment to justice for the innocent victims whose voices had been silenced by medical murder and village respectability. The morning brought Dr. Haydock to Miss Marple's cottage with the professional composure of a man accustomed to making house calls in times of crisis, though beneath his practiced bedside manner lay the particular tension of someone operating under considerable strain. His stated purpose was a routine follow-up regarding her recent consultation, but Miss Marple observed how his eyes moved restlessly about her sitting room, cataloguing details with the systematic attention of someone assessing potential threats rather than providing comfort to an elderly patient. The invitation and setup. Miss Marple had extended her invitation with the deceptive casualness that had served her well through decades of investigation, suggesting merely that she was troubled by recent events and would welcome the reassuring presence of their trusted village physician. Dr. Haydock had accepted with alacrity that revealed more about his state of mind than any direct questioning might have accomplished. He arrived carrying not only his medical bag, but also the particular alertness of a man who believed himself to be managing a dangerous situation. The tea table had been arranged with Miss Marple's customary attention to detail, though today each element served a purpose beyond mere hospitality. A fountain pen lay beside a blank card, apparently forgotten from her morning correspondence. A small bottle of wintergreen liniment sat wrapped in brown paper. A gift from her nephew that she mentioned had reminded her of hospital scents. Most significantly, a folded letter addressed to a London solicitor lay partially visible, its contents suggesting official communications about Mr. Grimm's ledger and the medical authorities' interest in historical records. The psychological duel. "You are very kind to come," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the gentle gratitude of someone genuinely appreciative of medical attention. "I dislike troubling the police with my little confusions, but these recent events have left me quite unsettled. Such violence in our peaceful village seems almost impossible to comprehend." Dr. Haydock settled into the offered chair, with movements that suggested both professional confidence and underlying wariness. "These tragic circumstances must indeed be distressing for someone of your sensitive nature," he replied, his trained voice carrying the particular warmth reserved for elderly patients. "Perhaps something to help. You sleep more peacefully. The mind can sometimes create troubling connections when under stress." As Miss Marple poured tea, she deliberately allowed the heavy pot to rest awkwardly on her left side, creating a natural opportunity for assistance. Dr. Haydock reached to help without thinking, pouring with his left hand in the economical movement of long practice. Miss Marple noted this detail with satisfaction while maintaining her expression of grateful helplessness. "Such a comfort to have professional guidance," she continued, lifting the wrapped liniment bottle. "This wintergreen oil my nephew sent reminded me of something, that particular scent I noticed near the cold door in the basement. One of those medicinal smells that only hospital-trained gentlemen would recognize." She unwrapped the bottle as if examining it more closely, though I suppose I might be mistaken about the specific type. "Carbolic, more likely," Dr. Haydock corrected automatically, then seemed to catch himself. His hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his teacup. Miss Marple's response was a masterpiece of apparent clumsiness. In reaching to set the bottle aside, she brushed the fountain pen with her sleeve, sending it clattering to the floor with a small spurt of ink onto the pristine linen tablecloth. "Oh dear, what a clumsy creature I am," she exclaimed with convincing distress. "Would you be so kind as to blot that? There's a clean card just there." Dr. Haydock took the card with his left hand, writing "blot" without conscious thought, followed by a hasty "sorry" as he noticed the ink spreading. The distinctive leftward slant of his letters and the characteristic drag of his S matched perfectly the handwriting sample Miss Marple had been hoping to obtain. She appeared to be fussing with the teapot, but her trained eye had already catalogued the evidence she needed. The tightening net. "It is such a relief that Mr. Grimm's ledger should provide clarity," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "Inspector Slack believes it will save considerable investigative effort once the authorities understand those payment records. £50 is quite substantial for a village bookseller, and to be paying such sums to someone listed as C. Finch. Cyril Finch, wasn't it?" "Cyril," Dr. Haydock confirmed quietly, the correction automatic before he could stop himself. The realization of his error showed in the slight flush that colored his professional composure. "Though I know nothing beyond village gossip, naturally." Miss Marple's smile was gentle and understanding. Of course, one mustn't trust gossip. Though my nephew tells me the medical register authorities are remarkably thorough about names and credentials nowadays. He's sending a handwriting expert from London this very evening, a Mr. Farnaby who specializes in analyzing how people form their letters. Fascinating how much one's writing reveals about character and background. The effect was immediate and telling. Dr. Haydock's grip on his teacup tightened, and Miss Marple observed the slight tremor that suggested his professional calm was beginning to fracture under psychological pressure. The medical gambit. "I'd wondered," Dr. Haydock said carefully, "whether it might be kinder for Miss Fortescue to surrender those historical documents. The poor girl is quite overwrought, and dwelling on such tragic events can be harmful to sensitive minds. Perhaps it would be more merciful to destroy such painful reminders." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes met his with deceptive mildness. "Kinder to whom?" she asked with gentle precision, then continued as if discussing an entirely different topic. "It is remarkable how Emily arranged to meet someone at the coal door, such a draughty spot for a romantic assignation. One hopes the gentleman didn't keep her waiting. Men can be so careless when they have ambitious plans, thinking foolishly that young women can be kept permanently quiet." Dr. Haydock set his teacup down with excessive care, the small porcelain sound unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense atmosphere. "I believe something may be burning in your kitchen," he said, though the air carried only the gentle scent of cinnamon and proper tea. "How thoughtless of me," Miss Marple replied, rising with apparent concern. At the kitchen door, she turned back as if remembering something important. "Oh, I nearly forgot. Inspector Slack particularly requested your presence at a parents' committee meeting this evening at the schoolhouse. 8 o'clock precisely. The staff feel quite nervous after recent events, and he thought your presence would be steadying. One never knows what additional revelations might emerge, does one?" The desperate gambit. When Miss Marple returned from her brief kitchen visit, she found Dr. Haydock examining the letter to the London solicitor with barely concealed interest. His professional mask was slipping more noticeably now, revealing the calculating intelligence beneath. "Merely requesting instructions about Mr. Grimm's ledger," she explained pleasantly. "Inspector Slack prefers the London authorities to handle such sensitive matters. He's particularly cautious about preserving evidence that might prove significant in court." Dr. Haydock's response revealed the full extent of his desperation. From his medical bag, he withdrew a small brown bottle containing what appeared to be a harmless sedative. "Given your obvious distress about these events," he said with renewed professional authority, "I believe a stronger medication would be beneficial, something to ensure peaceful rest without troubling dreams." Miss Marple accepted the bottle with appropriate gratitude, though her experienced eye noted its lack of proper labeling and the oily consistency of its contents that suggested something far more dangerous than a simple sleeping aid. Dr. Haydock's insistence that she take the medication immediately, under his direct observation, confirmed her suspicions about his murderous intent. "You know," she observed thoughtfully, "Emily Sparrow's papers suggest she had developed quite sophisticated medical knowledge, though I suppose her observations about certain treatments might have been mistaken." The mention of Emily's name produced an immediate transformation. Dr. Haydock's professional composure cracked entirely, revealing the cold calculation of a man who had killed multiple times and was prepared to kill again. Emily Sparrow was an imaginative girl who misunderstood perfectly ordinary medical procedures, he said, his voice carrying suppressed fury. Her disappearance was unfortunate, but hardly mysterious. Such women frequently seek their fortunes elsewhere when village life becomes restrictive. The confession. Miss Marple's gentle persistence in discussing Emily's specific medical observations, her documentation of suspicious symptoms, her careful notes about treatment protocols, her growing recognition of deliberate poisoning, finally shattered Dr. Haydock's remaining restraint. "You foolish old woman," he whispered with deadly quiet. Emily Sparrow died because she couldn't leave well enough alone. That medium died because she was too greedy for her own good. Mr. Grimm died because 20 years of blackmail finally became more trouble than it was worth. The confession, delivered with clinical detachment, revealed not only his guilt, but his complete absence of remorse. Miss Marple listened with the composed attention of someone whose suspicions had been definitively confirmed, while mentally preparing for what she knew would be his inevitable attempt to silence her permanently. "And now," Dr. Haydock continued, reaching into his medical bag with movements that had lost all pretense of healing purpose, "I'm afraid you're going to suffer a very unfortunate cardiac episode. So tragic when elderly hearts simply cannot cope with modern stresses." The final preparation. The syringe he withdrew contained what Miss Marple recognized as a concentrated cardiac stimulant, digitalis, or a similar substance that would cause apparent heart failure while leaving minimal forensic evidence. His medical knowledge provided him with both means and expertise to commit what would appear to be natural death, exactly as he had done with his elderly patients 20 years earlier. However, Miss Marple had not survived decades of confronting killers without developing sophisticated preparation strategies. Her seemingly innocent morning routine had included several arrangements that Dr. Haydock, focused on his immediate murderous intent, had failed to notice. The handwriting sample now secured, the confession recorded by the small device her nephew had provided for dictating correspondence, and Inspector Slack already positioned nearby, having received her carefully worded message about the evening's expected developments. As Dr. Haydock prepared his lethal injection, Miss Marple reflected with quiet satisfaction that the psychological trap had worked exactly as planned. The man who had successfully evaded justice for 20 years was finally revealing his true nature under the pressure of accumulated evidence and strategic manipulation. The confrontation had moved beyond detection into the dangerous realm of preventing additional murder. But Miss Marple was confident that her understanding of human nature, particularly the tendency of desperate killers to become reckless when cornered, would prove sufficient to ensure that Emily Sparrow finally received the justice that had been denied her for 2 decades. The stage was now set for the evening's final revelation, where Dr. Haydock's desperate attempt to destroy the remaining evidence would provide the conclusive proof needed to secure his conviction and bring peace to the troubled village of St. Mary Mead. The afternoon light in Miss Marple's sitting room had taken on the golden quality that comes just before evening, casting long shadows across the chintz furniture and lending an almost theatrical quality to the scene that was about to unfold. Dr. Haydock sat rigidly in his chair, the syringe gleaming ominously in his hand, while Miss Marple maintained her composure with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced dangerous killers before and understood that panic served no useful purpose in such circumstances. The psychological chess match. "You know," Miss Marple observed conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than her imminent murder, "I've always found it fascinating how people reveal their true natures under pressure. Take your handwriting this morning, for instance." She gestured toward the ink-stained card that lay on the tea table between them. The formation of those letters was quite distinctive, particularly the leftward slant and the characteristic drag of the S that marks a left-handed writer attempting to disguise their natural script. Dr. Haydock's grip on the syringe tightened, but Miss Marple continued with unruffled calm. Inspector Slack found identical handwriting characteristics in the note discovered among Madame Petrova's possessions, the same note that led her to investigate Emily Sparrow's disappearance with such fatal accuracy. The effect was immediate and telling. Dr. Haydock's professional composure, already strained by the morning's revelations, began to crack entirely under the weight of systematic exposure. "You interfering old woman," he whispered, his voice carrying the cold fury of a man whose carefully constructed life was collapsing around him. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The confession emerges. Miss Marple's gentle persistence finally shattered his remaining restraint. "Emily, Sparrow died because she couldn't leave well enough alone," he said with clinical detachment that was somehow more chilling than rage. A servant girl with pretensions to medical knowledge, documenting symptoms she was too ignorant to understand properly. She thought she was so clever, copying prescriptions, asking impertinent questions about treatment methods. His revelation that he had been systematically poisoning elderly patients using his medical authority came tumbling out with the desperate relief of someone finally unburdening himself of 20 years of carefully guarded secrets. They were dying anyway, he continued, his voice rising with suppressed fury. I merely accelerated the inevitable while ensuring their estates went to more deserving recipients. Emily discovered my methods and threatened to expose everything to the medical authorities in London. Miss Marple listened with the composed attention of someone whose suspicions were being definitively confirmed. So you arranged to meet her in the schoolhouse basement, promising romance but planning murder. She was so easily flattered by a medical student's attention, Dr. Haydock said with contempt. Young girls of her class always are. When I realized the extent of her knowledge and her determination to expose me, silencing her became a medical necessity. I used quicklime to ensure the evidence would be destroyed, then disappeared entirely, shedding the identity of Cyril Finch like a snake sheds its skin. The web of murder. The confession continued to pour forth as Dr. Haydock revealed the full scope of his crimes. For 20 years, I lived peacefully as Dr. Harold Haydock, respected village physician. Only Tobias Grimm knew the truth. He had helped me dispose of certain evidence and saw an opportunity for profit. £50 annually was a small price for his continued silence. His description of Madame Petrova's murder was delivered with the same clinical precision he might use to describe a surgical procedure. That theatrical medium brought everything back to the surface with her research and dramatic revelations. Her spirit message was far too accurate to be coincidence. She had discovered genuine information about Emily's fate. During the confusion of the séance, when I had deliberately sabotaged the electrical system, I eliminated her with the same efficiency I'd used on Emily. Miss Marple noted how his medical training had provided both the knowledge necessary for such precise violence and the professional composure to act decisively under pressure. And Mr. Grimm became a liability rather than an asset. 20 years of blackmail had become more expensive than murder, Dr. Haydock confirmed coldly. I rendered him unconscious with a medical sedative, then used his own letter opener to stage what appeared to be either suicide or a struggle with an intruder. The precision of the wound was perhaps too obvious, but by then I was operating under considerable time pressure. The net closes. As Dr. Haydock prepared to administer his lethal injection, the same concentrated cardiac stimulant that had killed his elderly victims decades earlier, Miss Marple revealed the final element of her careful preparation. I'm afraid your confession has been somewhat more public than you intended, she said gently, indicating the small recording device that had been quietly documenting their entire conversation. At that precise moment, as if summoned by her words, Inspector Slack's authoritative knock echoed through the cottage. Miss Marple, we received your message about this evening's developments. Is everything proceeding as planned? Dr. Haydock's face went ashen as he realized the full extent of the trap that had been carefully constructed around him. His desperate lunge toward the door was intercepted by Constable Polk, who had been positioned strategically outside, and the brief struggle that followed ended with the doctor subdued and his hands secured with professional efficiency. Justice at last. The evidence against you is overwhelming, Inspector Slack announced as he examined the dropped syringe and the recorded confession. Emily Sparrow's letter to the medical authorities, preserved for 20 years by Mrs. Clement, Mr. Grimm's ledger documenting decades of blackmail payments, the handwriting analysis connecting you to communications with Madame Petrova, the physical evidence from the basement excavation, including Emily's locket and the quicklime residue, and now your own confession to 3 murders spanning 2 decades. As Dr. Haydock was led away, his professional reputation destroyed and his crimes finally exposed, Miss Marple reflected on the systematic deception that had poisoned their peaceful village for 20 years. The man they had trusted with their health and lives had been a calculating killer who used his medical knowledge to commit murder while maintaining the appearance of compassionate care. The resolution, Miss Fortescue, who had arrived with Inspector Slack as a witness to the proceedings, stood quietly beside the window, her face pale but composed as she watched her mother's killer being taken into custody. "Emily Sparrow was my mother," she said simply, her voice carrying across the room with quiet dignity. "I never knew her, but I've spent my career teaching in the very building where she died, unknowingly walking daily over her grave." The revelation added both poignancy and closure to the case, as Emily's daughter had finally witnessed justice being served for crimes that had remained hidden for 2 decades. The locket that had preserved Emily's final message, the medical journal that documented her growing suspicions, and the courage of those who had preserved the evidence had combined to ensure that truth ultimately prevailed over even the most carefully constructed deception. Aftermath. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple settled into her familiar routine with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully brought a long-delayed justice to fruition. The village would heal from the shock of discovering that their trusted physician had been a systematic killer, but the knowledge that truth had finally emerged would strengthen rather than weaken the community's bonds. The séance that had begun as theatrical entertainment had evolved into genuine communication with the past, though through evidence and deduction rather than supernatural intervention. Emily Sparrow's voice, silenced for 20 years, had finally been heard in the halls of justice where it belonged, and her killer would face the consequences of crimes that had been hidden behind the respectable facade of medical practice. In the gathering dusk, as cottage lights began to twinkle across the village green and the familiar sounds of evening routines resumed their comforting rhythm, Miss Marple knew that the mystery of the séance beneath the schoolhouse had reached its proper conclusion. The past had finally been laid to rest, and the living could move forward with the knowledge that justice, however long delayed, had ultimately prevailed over murder and deception in their peaceful English village. The days that followed Dr. Haydock's arrest unfolded with the peculiar mixture of shock and stubborn resilience that characterized English village life when confronted with truth too large for comfortable acceptance. St. Mary Mead adjusted itself with the determined practicality of a community that had discovered evil wearing the mask of respectability, yet refused to be permanently poisoned by the revelation. The official resolution. Inspector Slack's investigation concluded with the methodical satisfaction of a case that provided overwhelming evidence and left no reasonable doubt about the perpetrator's guilt. The formal charges against Dr. Harold Haydock, revealed to be the long-vanished Dr. Cyril Finch, included 3 counts of murder spanning 2 decades, along with multiple counts of medical malpractice and systematic poisoning of elderly patients during his early career. The evidence assembled for the prosecution was both comprehensive and damning. Emily Sparrow's carefully preserved letter to the medical authorities, safeguarded for 20 years by Mrs. Clement's faithful discretion, provided detailed documentation of suspicious deaths under Dr. Finch's care. The handwriting analysis confirmed that the note found among Madame Petrova's possessions bore the distinctive characteristics of the same left-handed individual who had signed countless prescriptions as the respected village physician. Most conclusively, the recorded confession obtained through Miss Marple's careful psychological manipulation provided the prosecution with the defendant's own clinical admission of guilt, delivered with the chilling detachment of a man who viewed murder as merely another medical procedure. The excavation of Emily Sparrow's remains from beneath the schoolhouse basement had been conducted with appropriate dignity, though the quicklime had eliminated most physical evidence beyond the brass button, hair samples, and ribbon fragments that confirmed her identity. The medical examiner's report indicated that the positioning of the remains was entirely consistent with Dr. Haydock's description of the murder, while the presence of quicklime demonstrated both premeditation and sophisticated knowledge of methods for destroying evidence. Personal transformations. Miss Fortescue's decision to remain in St. Mary Mead as the village schoolmistress demonstrated remarkable courage and a determination to transform personal tragedy into positive purpose. The revelation of her parentage had brought complex emotions: grief for a mother she had never known, pride in Emily's courage, and a profound sense of connection to the very building where she had unknowingly spent her career, walking over her mother's grave. "She died fighting for truth," Miss Fortescue explained to Miss Marple during a quiet afternoon visit, her voice carrying the steady strength of someone who had found meaning in tragedy. "I shall honor that by ensuring the children I teach understand that courage sometimes means asking difficult questions, even when the answers might be uncomfortable." Her announcement of plans to establish a small memorial garden behind the schoolhouse, dedicated to Emily Sparrow's memory and to all those whose voices had been silenced by violence, was received with unanimous village support. The garden would serve both as a place of reflection and as a reminder that truth, however long delayed, eventually emerges through the combined efforts of those who refuse to let injustice remain hidden. Mrs. Weatherby experienced the complex emotions of someone whose worst fears had been confirmed, but whose decades of uncertainty had finally been resolved. The return of Emily's delicate locket and the knowledge that her young relative had died not through abandonment, but through courage in the face of evil, provided a form of closure that allowed proper grieving after 20 years of wondering and hoping. She wore her best black hat with a sprig of rosemary to the brief memorial service the vicar held in the basement, and when Miss Marple took her hand afterward, the old woman said simply, "She was a good girl, and so very brave." Community healing. The village's trust in medical authority had been profoundly shaken, but Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction that the community's response demonstrated the resilience that had always characterized rural English life. Rather than retreating into suspicion and fear, the residents of St. Mary Mead began the process of rebuilding their confidence in professional services, while maintaining the healthy skepticism that would prevent such systematic deception from occurring again. Mrs. Bantry, who had consulted Dr. Haydock regularly for her nervous headaches, found herself reviewing every prescription and treatment with the particular horror of someone realizing how close she had come to trusting her life to a systematic killer. Yet her response was characteristically practical. She immediately contacted a replacement physician from Much Benham and announced her intention to organize a comprehensive review of village health records, ensuring that no other suspicious patterns had gone unnoticed. The brass band resumed rehearsals with renewed vigor, as if louder hymns could restore the village's sense of security. The post office became a center of quiet reflection rather than excited gossip, with Miss Pollitt instituting the gentle habit of asking after everyone's health while remarking on the reliability of the London post, reminding all who overheard that letters, when properly sent, do arrive where they are meant to go. The broader implications, the revelation that a respected medical practitioner had been systematically murdering patients while maintaining the appearance of compassionate care, sent shockwaves through the broader medical community. The Medical Council announced a comprehensive review of all cases handled by Dr. Haydock during his career, with particular attention to elderly patients who had died under his care during his early years as Dr. Finch. Several exhumations were ordered, and the families of suspicious deaths received official notifications that their loved ones' cases would be reopened and investigated with modern methods. Inspector Slack, after a flurry of telegrams and consultations with county authorities, found himself grudgingly acknowledging Miss Marple's contribution to the case's resolution. During a brief encounter outside her cottage gate, he touched his cap with what might have been respect and muttered, "Quite neatly done, Miss Marple," before resuming his official composure and cycling away with renewed purpose. Miss Marple's final reflections. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple resumed her place by the window, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm that had accompanied her through decades of observation and investigation. She reflected on the case that had tested her understanding of human nature in ways both familiar and surprising, recognizing the systematic deception practiced by Dr. Haydock as more sophisticated than most criminal enterprises she had encountered. The psychological elements had been particularly complex, involving not merely the concealment of individual crimes, but the construction of an entirely false identity maintained over decades. Dr. Haydock's transformation from the discredited Dr. Finch into the respectable village physician demonstrated the lengths to which intelligent criminals would go to escape consequences while continuing the very behaviors that had made them dangerous in the first place. "People show themselves in the smallest ways," she murmured to herself, remembering the telltale details that had ultimately exposed the killer. The antiseptic scent on a door handle, the particular stubbornness of a floorboard, the left-handed formation of letters by a man who poured tea without thinking about which hand he used. Not in grand gestures, but in the little habits that forget their masks. The return to peace. The séance that had begun as theatrical entertainment had evolved into genuine communication with the past, though through evidence and deduction rather than supernatural intervention. Emily Sparrow's voice, silenced for 20 years, had finally been heard in the halls of justice where it belonged, and her killer would face the full consequences of crimes that had been hidden behind the respectable facade of medical practice. As cottage lights began to twinkle across the village green and the familiar sounds of evening routines resumed their comforting rhythm, Miss Marple knew that the community would heal from this profound shock. The knowledge that truth had finally emerged would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken the village's bonds, though the innocence of St. Mary Mead had been irrevocably altered. The schoolhouse, which had borne its secret so obediently for 2 decades, would resume its role as a center of learning and community. Mr. Roper had already replaced the disturbed floorboards with new oak, planed smooth and fitted without fuss, while announcing his intention to mark the area with a simple dab of white paint, not as a grim reminder, but merely to indicate where heavy storage should not be placed. In the gathering darkness, Miss Marple reflected that the mystery beneath the schoolhouse had reached its proper conclusion through the methodical application of observation, patience, and an unwavering commitment to justice for innocent victims. The past had been properly laid to rest, and the living could move forward with the assurance that truth, however long delayed, had ultimately prevailed over murder and deception in their peaceful English village. The game was concluded, but the eternal dance between good and evil, truth and deception, would continue as long as human hearts beat with the full range of motivations that made each mystery both unique and universal. Miss Marple settled into her evening routine with quiet satisfaction, knowing that justice had been served and that Emily Sparrow could finally rest in peace, her courage vindicated and her voice heard at last in the place where it had always belonged.